I'm actually out at the park right now. I came to record a video trying something different. One of the big things I'm doing with this whole process is making sure I'm learning and not just hammering away at running and lifting and just counting calories. So I've done a couple of Audible courses on nutrition before. Reading a new book right now. I just started it 2 days ago. It's called The Obesity Code, and I'm finding it very interesting. I will say I think he thinks his argument is more airtight than I do, but I will say a lot of the things I find him saying I think are logical and make sense. I just don't think it's as dramatic. So this one course I read from the great courses on nutrition, they basically lay out a premise that, and this is widely a widely accepted premise, that calories in, less calories out determine whether you're gaining weight, losing weight, and what your weight is going to be. And they come up with these calculations. My Net Diary, actually I use MyFitnessPal now. I used to use My Net Diary as a calorie counter. They use these calculations to count your calories to determine what your projected weight loss will be if you were to maintain a diet over time. And actually, I will say the nutrition course that I listened to last year from the great courses did note that metabolism varies greatly from person to person, but they said if you check your basal metabolic rate, that should tell you what your calories out are. But this book, The Obesity Code, really says it's basically impossible to track calories out. One of the premises he mentioned is that they're simply looking at basal metabolic rate, which is a function of your heart pumping and basically a small part of what you actually do. He said it is absolutely impossible to measure how many calories you are losing in fecal matter, and he said that's a huge amount. He said it's impossible to know how much your body is using for brain functioning, to rebuild cells, to rebuild muscle, to rebuild bone. So he said it's impossible to know. They're taking one facet of calories burned and basically looking at that. But he said different people are basically going to have very different metabolic rates, and using basal metabolic rate is just a poor way to use it. They're making too many assumptions, and they're essentially the US and basically most of what's known as Western world medicine basically have this premise that a calorie in, or a calorie versus a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. So essentially a calorie from a Big Mac is the same as a calorie from a piece of lean steak versus a calorie from a strawberry. And he's saying they're very different. They're measures of energy, but they send different signals to the body to do different things. I'm only on chapter 5. I'm 2.5 hours in on a 10-hour book, so I don't know necessarily what the punchline is, but I hear him setting it up to basically state that it is not just about how many calories you eat. And he essentially made the case that exercise, for one, he's saying that looking at studies, people who added, I think he said 600 calories of exercise a week over an extended period of time. There was a study done where they essentially stated this is what the projected weight loss would be, and the actual weight loss was much less. And his basic premise is that every function in the body is regulated, and so is fat storage and fat usage. He said the body does not just he gave the example, and it was pretty striking. He said certain people, let's take a marathon runner for example, the amount of calories they take in versus what they actually burn. If you look at how many calories they burn, and I can attest to this for myself last year based on the number of calories I burned or projected using my heart rate monitor. Who knows how accurate it is, but he said some of these people, let's take someone who's 200 pounds and builds a caloric deficit where over the course of a year they would lose 200 pounds. He says, well, does that happen? Does a person all of a sudden become 0 pounds? No. He said the body responds. He uses the term homeostasis, which is the body's desire to stay as it is. And he essentially stated that when you increase exercise dramatically, the body burns less energy because it wants to stay as it is. And he said the same thing happens when you increase your calories in terms of eating or you decrease them in terms of eating. But he also keeps driving home the point that the obesity epidemic in the US is something that has started in the 60s and 70s, and he said is advanced to just unbelievable proportions in just the course of 2 generations, from the baby boomers to my generation, Generation X. And he said if you look at prior generations throughout the course of history, obesity was a rarity. And the one thing he keeps driving home is these processed foods, high carbohydrate, processed carbohydrates, are really what trigger weight gain. He hasn't outright stated it yet, but in the first couple of chapters, he talks about how the infusion of all of these processed microwave foods with all of these chemicals in them versus just pure natural foods, he's saying there's a correlation between the influx of these foods into the American diet versus obesity, and saying how it's just reached it's become such a huge problem. And he noted the case of, you look at the number of dialysis centers versus in the 1960s versus now, he said they're almost as common as supermarkets. And he said that's because type 2 diabetes is just so rampant, and it has to do with the American diet changing. He said our genes have not changed in the course of 1 generation, from the quiet generation, my grandfather's generation, the Depression era babies, to the baby boomers, to Generation X. He's saying our genes did not change like that in 1 generation. He said genes change over the course of centuries. So he's saying it's not the genes. He's saying essentially it is the diet. And there's one interesting part I want to play. Hopefully I don't get a copyright strike. If the next thing you see is me talking, then when I tried to upload this, it got blocked. But I want to put one interesting part from the book in there.
The overfeeding paradox. Sam Feltham, a qualified master personal trainer, has worked in the UK health and fitness industry for more than a decade. Not accepting the caloric reduction theory, he set out to prove it false, following the grand scientific tradition of self-experimentation. In a modern twist to the classical overeating experiments, Feltham decided that he would eat 5,794 calories per day and document his weight gain. But the diet he chose was not a random 5,794 calories. He followed a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet of natural foods for 21 days. Feltham believed, based on clinical experience, that refined carbohydrates, not total calories, caused weight gain. The macronutrient breakdown of his diet was 10% carbohydrate, 53% fat, and 37% protein. Standard calorie calculations predicted a weight gain of about 16 pounds, 7.3 kilograms. Actual weight gain, however, was only about 2.8 pounds, 1.3 kilograms. Even more interesting, he dropped more than 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters, from his waist measurement. He gained weight, but it was lean mass. Perhaps Feltham was simply one of those genetic lottery people who are able to eat anything and not gain weight. So, in the next experiment, Feltham abandoned the low-carb, high-fat diet. Instead, for 21 days, he ate 5,793 calories per day of a standard American diet with lots of highly processed fake foods. The macronutrient breakdown of his new diet was 64% carbs, 22% fat, and 14% protein, remarkably similar to the US dietary guidelines. This time, the weight gain almost exactly mirrors that predicted by the calorie formula, 15.6 pounds, 7.1 kilograms. His waist size positively ballooned by 3.6 inches, 9.14 centimeters. After only 3 weeks, Feltham was developing love handles. In the same person, and with an almost identical caloric intake, The two different diets produced strikingly different results. Clearly, something more than calories is at work here, since diet composition apparently plays a large role.
So a really interesting story of how one person eating two vastly different diets with the same caloric intake, but obviously real foods, pure foods versus processed foods made in the lab. I mean, it would seem obvious that if you're eating chicken breasts and kale versus hamburger helper, you'd expect different results. But the most interesting point is that it was the same amount of calories, essentially 5,800 calories. And in one instance, he grew muscle and gained nearly like about 3 pounds. And in the other instance, he gained 16 pounds and his waist increased by 3.5 inches. So same person, but two vastly different experiences with the same amount of calories. It's difficult to say because I did do a lot of calorie counting last year. I was very disciplined at points for extended period of time. So I would not say the whole year, but I would definitely say the first 6 months of the year. Q3, I remember I plateaued quite a bit. And then early in Q4, when I really started to double down and I got frustrated with plateauing for most of Q3, I got much more disciplined with counting my calories. One thing I will say is whenever I count my calories, I do see striking results versus guessing. And I think the one thing is that I constantly tend to find that when I don't count my calories, I'm actually taking in a lot more than I believe. I don't buy 100% of what he's saying. I don't think it's 100% one way or the other. One thing he does say over and over in his book is 70% of weight gain or weight loss is genetic. This is based on how your body takes energy and processes it. Some people who run at a higher temperature will build more muscle, burn more heat, versus some people whose body will take the same amount of calories on the same diet and produce more fat. And he said that really is genetic based on basically the gifts you got from your parents. He talked about a study earlier in the book where he said they looked at orphans who were thin and went to obese parents and did not gain weight, and vice versa. He looked at orphans who were obese and went to thin parents and they didn't lose weight. And he essentially tried to make the case that this notion that it's more your habits than it is your genetics is false. And he used that as an example. He has a lot of very interesting examples, and I think he definitely has a point on some of this. I just don't know that I wholeheartedly believe that no matter what amount of calories you eat, if you're eating the right kind of foods and pure foods, the weight gain will be minimal. I personally don't buy that, but I'm very interested in his book. I'm only about 2.5 hours in on a 10-hour book, and I think I've been listening to so much, I'll probably finish this very quickly. So I'll check in with this again, but I wanted to share this. I wanted to document this so I can look back on this later and share it with anyone else who may have an interest in this book. But it's very interesting. His basic premise is that 70% of your disposition to gain or lose weight is determined by genetics, which is your metabolism and how your body essentially takes in food and how it actually uses it. And he said that comes from your parents. That exercise is really a small portion, but he did use an example where some control group did 600 calories of exercise a week. I mean, I did a bike ride this morning where I burned 1,200 calories. So I don't necessarily know. I think he said that in certain cases it would take an extreme amount of exercise. So maybe that's what it is with me, because yesterday I burned 500 calories just doing biceps and triceps, and I'll do that workout twice a week. I'm going to lift 5 times a week, and I'm going to do cardio 5 times a week. I will burn 6,000-7,000 calories. So maybe that falls in the definition of extreme. But I guess, yeah, maybe the average American, a workout for them is 100-150 calories. So maybe that's his premise, because I do see people who go to the gym and stay dedicated and work really hard make big differences. And I've seen people who have had somewhat mediocre diets, myself personally, when I was a teenager, but you can say that was an extreme amount of energy I would burn, because I would play basketball 4 hours a day all through the 90s. I'd eat McDonald's, KFC, whatever I wanted, and not gain weight. But I was a fat kid, like, make no bones about it. Before I played basketball, I was a very fat kid. So I always looked at it as the exercise was the end all be all, but I won't ever in my life have 4 hours a day to play 6 days a week of basketball, and my body wouldn't hold up to it. My limbs aren't like rubber anymore. So very interesting premise. I'm gonna keep listening. I'm gonna check in on this book again later, but so far really interesting, and wanted to share what I'm learning.